The main subject of this segment is the attempt by the United Nations to define human rights. In 1948, the UN passed a bill by majority vote, a bill called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It soon became the chief reference document for human rights in most of the world. Nearly all literature on human rights can be traced to this document. Its origin was in the writings of concerned intellectuals and social idealists in the 1920s and 30s. After World War II, the United Nations was set up and the subsidiary Human Rights Commission under the chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt. She had John Humphrey, a law professor from Montreal, who was director of the commission, draw up the first draft. The final draft was produced by René Cassin, a distinguished jurist from France and vice chairman of the commission. The declaration they produced was motivated not only by the indignation resulting from the atrocities of the just finished war, but also by the idealism that had rooted between wars and ripened into political power after it. Intellectuals in Europe and America moved to create ideal societies according to what they considered the high moral ground. That ground was not just recognition of people's fundamental right to security and equality of basic status, but in large measure an altruistic view of the population as an interdependent society. That is to say that every person was responsible for everyone else. How did any person acquire that responsibility involuntarily? In any case, to achieve this vision of ideal societies, rights were invented. The right to a minimum standard of living, to an education, and so on, as enunciated in Articles 22 to 28 of the Declaration. At the same time, certain rights of the individual were omitted: self-ownership and the sole right to control what one owns. Articles 22 to 28 specify rights that can be traced to need, and the assumption is that the need begets a right. I don't believe that anyone can show a structural link between a need and a right to have that need fulfilled by other people, at least not in regard to fundamental rights. Rather, this link must be fabricated by those who want it to exist. In doing so, they will refer to their values and morality, their resources, their available time, and in some cases the danger of helping others. Each person will make his or her decision, and this is how it should be. That means that the link between a need and a right is optional, and optional rights cannot be universal human rights. Therefore, need does not beget a right to have the need provided by other people, and rights based on need are false. Conclusion: Articles 22 to 28 of the UN Declaration are not really human rights. Furthermore, the UN Declaration is deficient in not including the property rights previously mentioned. There are other defects. The Declaration does not state that a human being has certain fundamental rights that simply go with being a person, whether or not they are included in the country's laws. The style of the articles is like input to the legal systems of the world's countries. The possible inference is that a person does not have these rights unless they are included in laws. The theory of rights that I have presented says that a person has fundamental rights regardless of what laws say or do not say. That is, are a priori rights. The UN Declaration did another bad thing for human rights. It was a precedent for inventing human rights for a purpose. Since then, other people have done just that in regard to medical benefits, employment terms, aggressive self-defense, and many others. The result has been considerable confusion on human rights. Inventing rights with a purpose in mind was a reasonable approach in designing the rules of the road, which are essentially the rights of people when behind the wheel of a vehicle on the public road, but is not the right approach to determining the implicit rights that a person has, because those rights result from natural ownerships. They must be discovered by deduction on the natural setup of a human being among his kind. The process is more or less similar to how we discovered the workings of nature or mathematics. When a theory of fundamental rights has that kind of intellectual integrity, it can be understood and accepted by any reasonable person. It is vitally important to resolve the dichotomy in human rights if the world is to go down the correct path. You, the viewer, must decide if the theory of human rights that I presented earlier is correct, or is the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with its errors, particular philosophy, and legal context, is the correct theory of rights. You must be objective and do more than refer to your personal morality or values, because these vary from one person to another, and especially from one culture to another. The correct theory must be acceptable to any reasonable person, as Pythagoras' theorem, for example, that is, intact logic that generates an inescapable conclusion. When you are done, come back for the next segment, when we will look at what governments have done with the UN concept of human rights. Hint, the welfare state that we see throughout the Western world and increasingly in the rest. We will also look at an alternative to that, a country based on true human rights. See you then.